Okay.
I was going to say, I don't see the record
I'm about
button.
to say, there it goes. Yeah, I had to press it twice. I was like, wait a minute, I don't see it. Yeah, okay.
So, what did you think? Let's start with you. What do you felt worked, and what do you think could be tweaked?
Well, for lesson 7, I know you had spoke a lot about blended learning, but that was not the goal for me
Mm-hmm.
doing that lesson.
Mm-hmm.
As I did lesson 7, I was more focused on making sure that I had addressed the things that I had intentionally planned for and attempted to modify them as necessary during the lesson. So that was my intent. So
Mm-hmm.
not sure how it got to being focused on blended learning, but that's what I think your write-up was more focused on.
When you say your focus was not on blended learning, let's talk about the evidence-based instructional strategy that you
Mm-hmm.
decided to use, because I took that. You had mentioned in the video that you were putting the kids in stations, um,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what you're referred to as far as blended learning, the stations I was talking about.
I guess that's the way it was. Um, you had interpreted, but I was placing them in more of a rotation, doing stations as whole group because the group was small in groups of 6.
Mm-hmm.
To me, you need at least, I would say, 12 to 15 students in the class to really do blended learning. So that
Mm-hmm.
wasn't my focus. So
Okay.
I did put them in rotations as we did a manipulative, which was a hands-on with creating the different tables and using the task card, the checklist, and then they did a digital manipulative where they had to create the graph using a website, and then we concluded with doing a park aligned assessment in order to do a formative to see where they were at. So a summative wasn't used during that lesson, but that was the flow and the purpose of the lesson. It was
Gotcha.
not so much as blended learning.
Okay. So here's the thing though. The theory and the pedagogy behind stations um, is that each station that they are doing something different. And when I say different, it could all kind of come together all at the end, but different as in working on different skills at each station.
Mm-hmm.
And what it sounds like you had everything there for stations. Where the error comes in, or I guess where I had to kind of grade you according to the rubric for the two, was if each table, whether or not it was 3 students, 6 students, 12 students, or 1 student, each table should have had a different task that they were doing. And then when they rotated, they would have moved on to the next station. For example, you said you had a task card, digital manipulative, as well as the parking line piece at the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at that one table should have been the digital piece. At the other table, it should have been the task card. And the third table could have been something different, where at the end, if you wanted to do the parking line, that last piece could have been the parking line um, piece there, or you could have brought them back as whole group and did the parking line piece all together, where they are putting together the skills that they've done at the first table and the second table to kind of do that. Um, whenever you use the word stations, it is already kind of put out there that they will be working on different skills in that station. Stations means that you're not doing whole group at all. They should not be doing the same thing at each table at the same time.
Okay. Okay.
So, and what I'm also hearing is I'm hearing that there's probably a breakdown in the vocabulary term,
Mm-hmm.
because when I think of blended learning is an array of things. Stations is one part of blended learning.
Mm-hmm.
Technology is another part of blended learning. But when you say stations, and I'm thinking down to the bare minimum of stations, right? Like, um, whether it is 2 people at the table or 3 or however, whatever skill that they're working on is completely different from the next table that is working on another different skill.
Right. I agree with that. But I guess for me,
Hmm.
I don't think that you necessarily have to, in order to use stations, it has to be blended learning, because
I agree.
everybody can be on the same task so that we can learn how to do blended learning. Now, as we assimilate throughout the school year, yeah, okay, now we're going to break in our groups. This is what we're supposed to do. They anticipate, they know, they're aware.
Hmm.
But considering that this is not something we do within our dynamic every day, it
Hmm.
was not done as rotational stations where everybody is making movement in 20 or 30 minutes. Um, so that's why I say it's just, to me, I didn't know the standard was aligned to me having to do a blended learning lesson. So,
So I'm gonna stop you. The standard is not aligned for a blended learning lesson.
okay,
So let's debunk that myth right there. That's not what the standard is about. The
okay,
standard is literally planning for instruction.
right.
And
But
when you
it seemed
plan,
like the whole lesson was based on blended learning, is what you
so
focused on.
okay, so the definition of blended learning is a formal education program in which students learn at least part through online learning with some element of student control over time, place, path, or pace. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I am only going off of what I saw in the video. You had them come in, you met them at the door, you gave them a do now task, right?
Mm-hmm.
After the do now task, the words that you used were, I'm putting you guys in stations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm telling you, pedagogically, the theory behind stations. And I don't want you to think about blended learning, because stations does not always mean blended learning, and blended learning does not always mean stations.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is that the bare minimum of stations is that this is one group working on one task. This is another group working on a different task.
Mm-hmm.
When you bring them back whole group, because they should have switched places to do those different tasks, there should be some type of product that comes out of those stations.
Okay.
And in the video, that did not happen.
Okay.
I think that there's a definition issue.
Well, I just think we just have to agree to disagree on this one, because I think what you're saying is not what I was attempting to implement.
Okay.
I felt that we did stations. We moved from the interactive to the digital and then the Parker line item. So it wasn't rotational, which is
Mm-hmm.
what the learning piece is about, but I
Mm-hmm.
believe that we were engaged in doing stations, and from my understanding. So we're just gonna have to agree to disagree on this one.
So, okay, I agree. Let's agree to disagree, but I have to push a little bit harder. So when it comes to, I guess, when it comes to the end product, right?
Mm-hmm.
What were your, how would you use the end product to inform your next steps, in going forward, in what you're asking the kids to do? Like, what is the overall object for them to gain from the stations?
The understanding of the independent versus the dependent variable,
Mm-hmm.
creating a function of input and output, to be able to state that the input is exactly one outcome. So therefore, X cannot repeat, but Y can. Showing it through a table, which was the first activity, communicating the same information through a graph, which was the second activity, and then but with the Parker line item to be able to identify which was not a function, which is what the task was for the Parker line item.
Okay. And then going from this lesson, so they got a chance to break it down. They got a chance to use it in a graph. They also got a chance to identify what was not a function, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where in that do you see yourself, or do you see when it comes back to the rubric? Let me pull the rubric up. Where do you see do you feel like any of that could have been, I guess, what am I trying to say? Because I know that we talk a lot about like student discourse in the past. I know we talked about a lot about like releasing yourself and things of that nature. Talk to me a little bit about some of the misconceptions that you feel like some of the kids may have had, and how would have been addressed within the lesson?
Well, one of the statements that Veronica had made was that I asked about can Y repeat, can X repeat? And she stated yes. So I had another student to explain why that's not correct. And the other student had told her X can't repeat because X can only be one input, but Y can. So when she identified in the table or on the graph, because we were working on the graph, she was like, oh, so the whole point was for them to be able to look at the graph as well as the coordinates and tell me if it was or was not a function. And it was not a function because 7 repeated in X.
Mm-hmm.
So she told me that it was, and another student guided and was like, no, because if you look at the graph at this coordinate in the beginning and the one at the end, they both have the same X. And so that's when they were able to, or she was able to see that visually, and she was like, oh yeah, now I see. So we were able to correct that in motion as we were actively doing the lesson.
What adjustment to your lesson could have been made, I guess, in that moment? Because I wonder if she's the only person that had that misconception.
Well, no, it's a common misconception. And until you truly understand the rules associated with the function,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to have that misconception. So therefore, that's why I gave it to them with the visual aid and them sorting the cards and having them mix up the tables, because they created 2 tables on those cards. One table was to show you that it was a function, but then when you switch positions of the numbers, it shows you that it couldn't be a function. And then we went into the digital, which is the graphing online, and that one was to assist in reinforcing what they already should have taken from the first activity. So the first activity was for them to truly grasp what is and is not a function. The second activity was for them to now take coordinates and put it on a graph and be able to identify, because your graph is going to have 2 points touching at the same coordinate. So that's when I was able to communicate to them the vertical line test that says if you have a line that touches twice on any particular point, then it is not a function. But that's something that's just a trick to the trade. You really need to understand the concept before I teach that. So I don't teach that in the beginning. I teach it at the end once they understand.
So how much time did you give them for each activity?
Each activity, they received roughly 15 to 20 minutes.
So in 15 to 20 minutes, and I'm only calling out names because these are the names that I remember. Okay, so don't shoot me in the foot. Valerio and his partner let's say they're at table 1, Veronica and her partner are at table 2, and then there's a Cindy, right?
Yeah. She
Okay.
wasn't in there that day, but yeah.
Okay. So I'm just going to throw her name out. Cindy and her partner are in table 3. So they have about 15 to 20 minutes to work on each activity. And then after each activity, so the first activity you have about 15 to 20 minutes. You bring them back and you talk to them about what it is they were supposed to do in that first activity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. 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 Do you have any questions for me?
Nope.
Okay. So reading back over the rubric as well as the evaluation, that evidence-based instructional strategy, again, like when it comes to stations, I understand that they weren't rotating through. I understand that. But essentially, they are supposed to be working on skills to master the bigger piece, which in your case was the parking line assessment. Hold on 1 second. My phone is ringing. Can we pause really quickly? What was I? When planning stations, each station should test or assess a different skill or be different, and it's helpful to sketch out the stations per paper. I think you definitely had the recipe, and it is essentially working well together. What really would have moved you to the 3 is if one group was doing the graphing piece while another group was doing the task cards. Even if you did not have them rotating, being able to talk about still giving your whole lesson first, but then having them access those different skills in a different way, and then maybe following it up with that last piece about what is not a function, I think would have moved you probably from a 3, even maybe up to a 4, giving them the chance to use those different skills, and then kind of allow you to facilitate the learning. It's tough. It's tough. I do mention blended learning, and I know I gave you a couple of different pictures and things of that nature, where there's a student-led instruction, a teacher-led instruction. There is collaborative activities, which you had them doing. Yeah. And I'm just thinking about the adjustments to the lesson piece. If you're saying that that is a common misconception, the one that Veronica had, to think about in that moment, it was brilliant that you had another student kind of answer that. But in that moment, how could you have adjusted the entire lesson to just make sure that they're all on the same page? Even though Veronica was able to go back and kind of reevaluate and realize what, the true answer is, how could you have made sure that the rest of the, 7 or 8 all understood to a deeper understanding? I think that's all I have for that. Do you have any questions for me?
That's it. I'll go ahead and stop this one.
Okay.